Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're giving a webinar this evening, the first of two parts, on the fire ceremony and the purification ceremony, which are rituals that have been part of Ananda, really, the purification ceremony for not quite 30 years, and the fire ceremony really since the beginning of Ananda, although by no means did we invent it. And those are some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to go back for just a moment to the early days of Ananda, which at that time was one place, Ananda Village. In fact, it wasn't even Ananda Village. At the beginning, it was Ananda Meditation Retreat. And Swami Kriyananda, it was like this was 1978, 79, excuse me, 68, 69, 70, 71. So it was like within the decade that Swami Kriyananda had lived in India. And we were still in those early years living a little bit more in what I would call an Indian bhav, just dressing more in Indian clothes, doing more Indian chanting, just sort of thinking along that way. And I think Swami Kriyananda himself was, he didn't choose to leave India. It was forced upon him by SRF's decision, Self-Realization Fellowship's decision to expel him from the organization, and he'd been there representing SRF. So once he wasn't representing them anymore, there was no way for him to be there. And also at the same time, it was difficult after that for a decade for him to get a visa. But his heart was really in the Indian bhav of things. In fact, it's interesting later, maybe 10 years later, he used to sing a lot of Indian bhajans and sing Indian songs, solo songs that he would sing by himself. He said at a certain point in his life, this is not related to our subject, but it's part of everything. He said he had to stop singing those songs because I think karmically his soul is much more Indian than Western. And he found that he couldn't relate to the Western consciousness, or I think to put it more accurately, he didn't want to relate to the Western consciousness if he allowed himself to be too much in the Indian bhav. So he had to forcibly turn away from the Indian bhav in order to do the work that Master wanted him to do, which is why in many ways being back in India for Swamiji on a certain level is both a homecoming and a relaxation and an ability to sink back into what is most natural for him, that intuitive, devotional. We're not talking about politics or current India or economics or even who's incarnated there now. It's more something deeper that's, in a sense, divinely planted by the divine. Divinely planted, of course, means by the divine, God's will for the balance of the planet. The continent of India holds a certain reality. I guess I've only recently returned from 8 weeks there, so I can speak like that. Exasperating as the country can be in terms of politics, bureaucracy, and all of that. The truth of it is something else. Well, Master, you know, of course, was Bengali, and he came to America from India. But he was always, he never came to Indianize Americans, even though he loved his homeland, and in the last moments of his life, he spent reading a poem that was dedicated to my India. And he loved India, especially when you read the words of that poem. You can see how profoundly he connected with that continent in the way that I'm talking about, it being the spiritual heart of this planet. But he did not bring to America a particularly Indian expression of spirituality. He did have some of the nuns at times wear saris, and he himself wore an Indian-style robe, but his robe was kind of a compromise between East and West. And he was always looking for sort of compromises between East and West. But he could have brought arati and puja and a lot of Sanskrit mantras and rituals, and many of the kutramants of Hinduism were quite within his purview and could easily have been transferred. But he did not. Interesting, as I think about this, Sri Yukteswar, the main festivals at Sri Yukteswar's ashram were the solstices and the equinoxes. He didn't, even Sri Yukteswar didn't pick up any of the traditional Indian holidays. I don't know, I can't speak to how common equinox and solstice celebrations are or were in India. But it's interesting that those were the 4 times a year when he drew all his disciples together. He didn't build it around Hindu gods and goddesses or traditional festivals of any kind. I mention this because nothing that these avatars do is an accident. And even though we don't want to, on any level, be mindless in our relationship to these masters, it's folly not to pay attention to what they did. Because so often the intention is so much more than we may think it is. They're moving in attunement with the divine flow of energy. The majority of people are acting from various levels of cross currents of ego. But these great saints and masters have none of that. And they respond to deep levels of reality, and that's all. I'm going to put in one more peripheral point just because it's in my mind, because I just read it. I've been rereading the book by Kamala de Silva, The Flawless Mirror, which is not a biography either of her or of Master, but it's a memoir of Kamala's experiences with Master. She met him when she was 12 or 13 and knew him to the end of his life, and then outlived him by some 20-some years, or 30 years maybe. But she has all of his letters in there. And about 1951, there's a letter. And in the middle paragraph of that letter from Master says, Divine Mother has given me a lot to do with the Korean situation, and I've been very busy with that. Now, Master was not a general. He didn't go to war. He was a Hindu, a Swami, an Indian teacher in Los Angeles during the Korean War. But Swamiji has told us that Master said, and I quote this, that it was Master himself who put into the mind of President Harry Truman that he should defend Korea against the incursions from the north of the communists, because Master felt the threat to that whole area was enormous, that if the communists got all through Korea, they would sweep through Southeast Asia, and it would be a very bad thing for the world. Communism being atheistic, it had nothing to do in Master's mind with their economic policies or their class or caste policies, but they're atheistic. I mean, profoundly, actively atheistic. They destroy people's faith in God and try to replace it with faith in the state. And Master saw that as an evil that had to be stopped. And so he wrote that note, Divine Mother has given me a lot to do with the Korean situation. What was he doing? When was he doing it? How did that possibly manifest? Just fascinating. Now, I was saying that in the context of everything that the Masters do is deliberate. So the fact that when Master came to America, he did not bring with him rituals, gods, goddesses, pujas, traditional holidays, very, very little of that. He liked saris. But Swamiji remarked too, Swamiji always thought saris were the most beautiful outfit a woman could wear. And actually traveling in India, I agree, flattering to all figures and exquisitely beautiful. But they're impractical for 20th century life, even though SRF nuns still wear them. Even the Indian women who still wear traditional dress have gone to the salwar kameez, which is essentially the dress that I wear too, which is a tunic and pants, because it's just more maneuverable for the life that we live. But Master did occasionally do fire ceremonies. And he perhaps did the mantras. I don't know for certain, but I think Swamiji would not have carried them on if Master hadn't done them. So I'm trusting that Master did them. You see a few pictures of him doing fire ceremonies. So from the beginning, and this is where I'm coming back to, in the very early years of Swamiji running a retreat on the land that is still the retreat in the Sierra Nevada, where Ananda Village is and where we all started. We all, the collective Ananda we, which is, those of you who have never even been to America, that's where we all started. Where your physical body was doesn't matter, your spirit's part of the whole story now. This is family history. And in those days, just before Sunday service was at 11, and at 10 o'clock, perhaps 10:30, I don't remember accurately, we always had a fire ceremony in the summer because there was an area, it was a 5-minute walk from the temple, and there was a big fire pit that they dug, and then they dug it quite deep, deep enough so that there could be 2 tiers also just dug right out of the dirt, 2 tiers where people could sit. And then Swami would sit in the bottom tier. So it was a little amphitheater, a natural circular amphitheater. And all summer long, Swamiji would come there. He lived there for a time, and then when he moved, he would drive up, and he would always be dressed in his Indian, his orange clothes. And in the very early years, he would often walk around bare-chested in just a dhoti with his Rudrakshamala and his long hair, very much in the bhava of an Indian sadhu. And he would sit right next to the fire pit, and we'd have all the wood and the ghee and the rice there. And Swamiji would perform the fire ceremony, and he would do the mantras, and we would throw rice into the fire. I'm trying to recall whether he always did both mantras, and maybe we just threw the rice for the second mantra. That would be yes, of course, that would be the way we do it now. We do ghee for the Gayatri Mantra, which is the first mantra, and that mantra is for personal liberation. And then we do the Mahamudra Mrityunjaya mantra, which is for the liberation of the whole world. The first mantra is a chant to Vishnu, the preserver of the universe, to dissolve our attachments, and it helps purify you against negative forces, negative emotions. And the second one is to Lord Shiva, the destroyer of all ignorance. And also it's to liberate us from all that binds us. And the way it's described is the energy liberated when our negativity is dissolved goes out into the world as peace and harmony. So the second one is for the whole world. And we'd always do both, for our own liberation and for the whole world. But we never had, I have to say, a very clear idea of what the words mean, because they're mantras. And mantra is a very important concept. We in the West who are very meaning-oriented a lot of the time. But when you think about the fact that everything in creation is an expression of the Om vibration, and everything in creation is energy vibrating, and it vibrates, and when we're listening to the Om, we're moving away from the specific reality that we're living in back to the source energy. The book of Genesis says in the beginning there was light, but the Gospel of John says in the beginning was the Word. And so it's referring to 2 of the fundamentally 8 manifestations of God, which is light and sound. And so sound being a source of creation itself, sound has a certain power over creation. Now, we've in this particular age, which was early Dwapara, we've lost connection to a certain extent with the real power of sound. It has been postulated by Swamiji and others that the Great Pyramid of Egypt, now I have to just backtrack just slightly and say, when we talk about the yugas, which I won't bother to teach here, there's an excellent book that you can order from Crystal Clarity called The Yugas. It's a 24,000-year cycle of descending and then ascending degrees of awareness on this planet based on the astronomical fact of the orbit that our whole solar system is following, that our whole galaxy is following, and when it's, that our whole solar system is following when it's near or farther away from the center of energy for the whole galaxy. That's a very brief summary. But it's a fact that causes the awareness on this planet, more energy comes to this planet and awareness is higher or farther away and energy sinks, consciousness sinks. So the great civilization of Egypt, Swamiji often mentions this, appeared at its peak, insofar as we know anything about it at all. It did not develop. And that's because it was Satya Yuga and then Treta Yuga being the third yuga, descending. So it went from its highest point and then gradually became corrupted. So we have evidence of that enormous advancement, primarily in the form of the pyramids and the Sphinx and a few other monuments like that. But as the Yuga descended down to its nadir at 500 AD, and then started up again, and we shifted over into Dwapara Yuga at 1900, and nobody remembered how they built the pyramids. So it's all been figured out in terms of slaves and ramps and people, poor tortured people having to drag those rocks up and so on. Actually, Swami talks about this in his book, The Time Tunnel, which is actually a book more or less written for young readers, but absolutely full of fascinating insights. And so Swamiji talks about Egypt there, and what he postulates, and has postulated at other times, is that those stones, anybody looking at those stones that make up the pyramid, the size of the stones, the height of the pyramid, none of the mechanical explanations that we know actually really work when you really follow them out. They just simply don't work. It doesn't make any sense. But what Swamiji has postulated is that they were actually moved in place by the power of sound. Now, that's not really so strange when you think about it, because think about all that they're doing with what they call ultrasound right now. They're using sound waves in all kinds of ways that no one could ever have imagined. It's absolutely common now for a pregnant woman to go in and have an ultrasound done. And they put some little device, and who knows, maybe some of you know exactly how it works. We just take it for granted. But it's called ultrasound. So the imaging technique is based on sound waves. And you can watch your developing fetus, and you can watch its little heartbeat, and that's how come you can determine the gender of your child now before it comes out of the womb, is because the ultrasound picture, which everybody just says those words without thinking, shows you a picture. It's a use for sound. Who would have imagined? Kidney stones is another good example of another one of many, which is that it used to be when you had to have your kidney stones operated, and they just made a huge gash in your body, and it was a huge operation, took weeks and weeks to recover. Now they put you, at least the last time I knew, which was already now 15 years ago, so maybe it's completely changed. In fact, it was in the early 90s, so it's a little even longer than that. It's probably all the technology has changed, but when a friend of mine had the procedure, he sat in a tub of water, and then they projected sound waves, and they dissolved the kidney stones inside his body with sound waves. So the sound wave was strong enough to dissolve a kidney stone, which is a hard entity, but not damage the tissue. That's a pretty darn subtle use of sound waves, isn't it? So what we're hearing here, and it's long been known that certain sopranos can shatter glass, or certain tones of a violin, that you can, in other words, you can move physical objects by the power of sound. And in higher ages, enlightened souls perceive directly the vibratory nature of many aspects of reality, and were able then to hear or intuit what it would sound like to the human ear in order to be right on that particular wavelength of consciousness or of things or whatever. One of the many reasons why Sanskrit is considered a sacred language is because the way it's explained is that the sound of Sanskrit is closer to the actual sound of things than other languages. And it's interesting how many languages derive from Sanskrit, because one of the characteristics of a higher age, which we're moving back into, is that culture, the planetary culture unifies. That's all in the Yuga's book. I get so fascinated, I can just go off on that. I can just go down that road and just never come back. So I'm going to resist. But among the reasons why Sanskrit is considered sacred is that, because when you name things in Sanskrit or describe them in Sanskrit, the sounds that you hear with the human ear and make with the human voice put you in connection with a higher vibration of reality, of those realities. The mantra that we use for watching the breath, the Hong Sa mantra, is said to be the sound of the breath. It's always amused me because when you fall asleep, and if you snore, the sound of a snore is like a distorted Hong saw, like that. You don't really say the mantra that way, but if you're going to say the mantra, I was starting to say backwards. If you're going to say the mantra from the opposite side or something, we often joke when people fall asleep in meditation, that they're doing the Hong snore technique, which, anyway, to prove the point. Which is why we encourage people when we teach them that technique, no, don't substitute just any other words, because these words actually connect you to the state of consciousness you're trying to have. So in the fire ceremony, we do those Sanskrit mantras, and we don't, like Master, because Swami does everything according to the way Master did it, we don't impose a lot of Sanskrit on our situation, because even in India, people don't know it. They're more used to it, but they don't know what it means. And no one in America does, unless they've studied, but most people in America don't. But the sound of the mantra itself actually changes the vibration of your being. The sound of a true mantra will do that. It shifts your vibration, and it shifts your vibration closer, according to the mantra, of course, but it moves your vibration in the direction of what the mantra represents. So when we say that the Gayatri Mantra is about personal liberation, and that it purifies you, and that it dissolves negative thoughts within you, it's because those, the elements within us that are contrary to our divine nature, that are vrittis that we ourselves have created by having energy circle around an egoic identification that is limiting to our divine nature, the actual sound of the Gayatri Mantra influences that energy to release, influences that energy to be absorbed into the mantra. Everything eventually will be absorbed into the light. No contrary pull to the light can exist forever. It can exist for a long time if we commit ourselves to it deeply. But sooner or later, everything dissolves into the river of spirit, and the bubble goes back to the ocean. So in reciting these mantras, the first one we're actually changing ourselves, and the second one we're changing ourselves and then also changing the world. So many people have a desire to do something for the world, but it's very hard to do much for the world right now. The news is just always bad and then gets worse. Not merely, well, it's heartbreaking, the news right now. I don't want to go too deeply into it because it actually literally makes me weep. The selfishness, the greed, the sheer knavery. I was thinking about, man, when the history of these decades is written, the future generations are going to ask, how did they get away with that? How did a handful of extraordinarily greedy people manage to injure so many others? But I guess we just get what we need in order to grow, and that's where we are right now. But people want to know, how can I help? A friend of mine told me recently, I was talking about the fact that I rarely vote. Please don't think me irresponsible, but I just can't choose. I can't figure out who among what I perceive to be almost universally self-serving individuals would be some fraction less self-serving than another. Maybe others of you may disagree with me, but I can't tell. And then I was told that in India, they have you can actually vote that says, I don't support any of these people. And that's something you can check. So that because India is a newer country, the opportunity to vote is considered a privilege, and I guess a lot of people were not voting because they said they didn't support any of them. So they wanted to prove that it's not because they're disinterested or too lazy to vote, they just don't support any of them. So they get to check that. I think it'd be a great thing to have on the American ballot. But then, of course, people get elected by an even smaller percentage of voters. Okay, the end of all of that, where I was going, this is early Dwapara. I have to say that to myself every once in a while. This is early Dwapara. This is what you get in early Dwapara. And one can see a better world than this, but apparently not collectively. It's just not time. The planet is not meant to be that good yet. but we want to do something about it. But the problems that we have are problems of consciousness. So many of these people who are behaving in ways that they will someday be ashamed of, they don't have the awareness yet to be ashamed of it, but in some future incarnation, they'll be deeply ashamed of themselves, and they will also have to bear the consequences of what they have done, which is why we don't really need to worry, because they'll get it. Get it, learn it, is what I mean, by the opportunities given to them. But what I was saying is, it's not a lack even of intelligence or resources or anything. It's the lack of proper consciousness. People's consciousness is too low, and therefore they think that if I take for myself, that will make me happy. And if I take for myself at the expense of others, it's of no consequence. Because their awareness is so limited, they don't understand their unity with all beings. They don't see the unity of all life. They just think it's not their problem. If they've been clever enough to get for themselves, then what they did to get there is just not their problem. They will learn. But as you see, it's just a matter of awareness. Their consciousness is too low, too ego-centered to cognize the reality of someone outside of themselves in their own little circle. But that's a vibration, you see. Consciousness is just a vibration. It's a vibration of distance from the source. If you move yourself, if the fundamental sound is Om, and the farther away you move from Om, you don't hear Om anymore. You hear modern music, and you hear yelling and tempers and self-serving thoughts, but you're still a manifestation of the Om. You're just so far from the source that vibration has become deeply distorted. And what draws people back is what they feel when they hear the true sound of Om, or a truer sound of Om. Even a very, very selfish person can get satisfaction from helping someone. And they'll feel, oh, that felt good. Usually it's someone from whom they also hope to get a favor, or someone with whom they identify like their own children. And some people are purely selfish, but most people are generous in a few places, and they like that feeling. And that's how we learn, because the vibration is higher, and you're closer to your source. What makes us miserable is when we're far away from our source and we're in dissonance with our source. But, okay, coming back to this, so a mantra, when we recite it, it actually just literally transforms us. It makes us someone other than we have been, because we are only a vibration of energy. That's such a vitally important point to understand. We're only a vibration of energy. Even though we inhabit a physical body, even the physical body, this is scientific, it's just a vibration of energy, which means it's completely, it can be completely shifted by the application of the right vibration. Right meaning that which takes you closer to your source, and therefore it takes you closer to your bliss. So that's where all these rituals came from. They came from higher ages, and then they became ritualized and dogmatized as the age descended. This is also beautifully explained in the Yugas book. But the mantra itself still has the power. And it has the power, and this is the Mahamudra Mrityunjaya. I was trouble saying that. Mahamrityunjaya. Put mudra in there. I kept thinking mudra doesn't fit in there. Mahamrityunjaya mantra. It actually sends out a universal vibration. So, when we're in despair over the state of the world, put on the recording of Swami doing that mantra and sit with him and send it out to the world. It's really the most useful thing you can do. Because when we change awareness and consciousness, and all those ready to receive it will receive it. To all of those who have ears to hear, that's where it'll come in. And that's the only way that things will ever be changed. And of course the planet's rising, so gradually more and more people will hear this. So now let me come back to where I am. So in those early years, Swami Kriyananda would come every morning, every Sunday morning. We would sit there, and he would sit, and he would put the ghee in himself. He was the pujari. He would be the priest for us. And we would have handfuls of rice, and we would throw the rice into the fire, exactly as we do now. Well, in Palo Alto, in the warm weather, we go outside, and we all throw rice into the fire in the same way that Swami did it. in the cold weather when we have to be inside, it's not as practical for everyone to throw rice. So whoever's acting as the pujari, as the priest, puts the rice in representing everyone's karma. And we all don't get to put our hands on our own karma. But it was always part of our flow of energy. It was just that little bit of a carryover from an ancient tradition that many of us, karmically remember, you might say. And the other element of it always, well, there were four elements. There's the mantra itself, of which I've been speaking, for half this webinar. But then also when we would do that ceremony, there was also ghee. And ghee is purified butter. And ghee represents devotion, the purified devotion of the heart. The heart has many aspects, and it can commit its energy in many directions. But when we purify our heart, and this comes in later when we start talking about the purification ceremony, the word purify it applies in both ceremonies. Purify means to remove from something that which corrupts its true nature. When you make ghee, you take butter, which is solid, and I usually make it boiling. When I do make it, I boil it on the stove, and it begins to boil in this, with the milk solids, that it foams on the top and you skim off the foam, and then the milk solids settle to the bottom. And right in the middle is a liquid that is, when it's done correctly, is perfectly pure and golden. What's interesting about ghee, it's apparently it lasts almost indefinitely. If you store food against hard times, ghee doesn't spoil because all the impurities are gone from it, and what's left is so pure that there's nothing in there to disintegrate. It just remains as it is. It's become eternal. I mean, perhaps eternal is too long, but it lasts longer than any other oil without going rancid. Interesting, isn't it? If it's made correctly and stored correctly and all those things. So not only is it a nice cooking element and a healthy element Ayurvedically and in other ways, and it's purified, clarified butter, they call it in French cooking, is a wonderful flavor. But in terms of its symbology, it symbolizes the purification of the heart. It's this pure, clear, golden liquid that's left when all of the obstructing solids are removed. And of course, it's also created by the application of heat. And, heat, we say, I'm in hot water, don't we? I'm really in hot trouble today. We use the word hot also to mean when, things are heating up. The criminal says, if things get too hot in this town, I'll just skip this town. I'll just run away from town if it gets too hot here. Please get hot on your trail. And so the image, which is also the image of fire, is that the heat is applied. And in the process of making ghee on top of the stove, as I said, it bubbles up. It just sort of, everything that's not good just rises to the surface with the application of heat, or also falls to the bottom. And that's how it is with us. We're transformed by the application of heat. One of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's a very powerful one, and it describes a certain stage of wisdom, and that stage of wisdom is the recognition that spiritual expansion often comes through suffering. And it's in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, it's that, why do we suffer? Because we don't learn unless we suffer. We're not purified unless the heat is applied to us, and the heat is intensity and experiences that are contrary to our egoic preferences, that force us to raise our awareness and increase our energy and expand our sense of identity to a greater reality, all the different ways that heat could be described in a human experience. But what it does is that it causes to rise to the surface. And actually, when I make ghee, if I boil it often enough, there's almost nothing left in the bottom. There's often just a little in the bottom, but mostly it rises up and I can just take it off. But when it's just sitting there, you don't even know it's in there when the butter's solid. But you add the heat and it rises up and you take it off and you take it off and you take it off. And then pure golden liquid, clear, pure golden liquid is left. I mean, the image is too obvious, isn't it? And in Jesus' gospel, he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And the pure in heart means that those who have purged all their attachments, all their desires, all their egoic self-identities, and all that's left is pure feeling. And pure feeling, chitta, is what is the definition of who we are. And that pure chitta, pure feeling, is bliss. Everything else that isn't bliss is one of the impurities. So anything you feel that isn't bliss is a definition of the necessity to purify your heart. So when we do the Gayatri Mantra, which is the mantra for our own freedom, our own spiritual liberation, our own purification, the pujari, the priest, takes a spoonful of ghee each time and puts it in the fire. And that represents the purity of all our devotion. In the Bhagavad Gita, one of our recent Sunday service readings, it said, "He who seeks God with impure motive doesn't see God, but he who seeks God with pure motive," is how they put it. And motive in this sense would be just all that we, all the desire that we have for God to bless our desires and grant our desires, instead of actually just loving God without motive. Loving God because it's our nature to love, rather than all the motives that we have. And all those motives are about our self-identification that we're trying to preserve in one way or another. Very complicated. So here we are in front of a fire, and you have an intermediary of the priest, but that's just a practical matter. I mean, anybody's qualified to put the ghee in the fire. It's just that when you have a lot of people, only one can really do it, or else you really have a mess on your hands. So he puts that in to the fire, and everybody watching that is offering their heart's devotion into the transforming fire. And fire is, I mean, in itself, of course, it's fascinating, fire. I mean, mankind has been fascinated by fire forever. Sitting in front of any kind of a fire, you can just watch the flames almost endlessly. There's something so intoxicating about real fire. And I was thinking in our Festival of Light, I talked about this in the webinars that I was doing about the festival, when we light the candle, the taper of inner communion that we call it, and it's a tall taper, and we light that candle and then bring it forward, and we say in the Festival of Light, referring to the candle flame, "Gaze upon this light as a symbol of God's love." Well, you can say, well, it's beautiful, and it's all these different reasons you can say, but sometimes in our temple here, which is a substantial sized temple, I'm holding that candle. The flame is, tiny, just half an inch maybe. It's not a big fire. It's a single candle wick. And sometimes I'm being the pujari myself, and at other times I'm sitting in the congregation. Sitting in the congregation in our in our not small temple. And I look at that candle flame, and I often sit toward the back. So I'm quite a few rows back. I can't estimate feet, but it's a solid distance. And still, I can look right at that candle flame. We know there's 25 rows of people between me and that candle flame. And still, I can see that candle flame so vividly. And there's many dimensions of that being a symbol of God's love. Wherever you are, however many people are in the room, however distant you may seem, still, one candle, all that distance, you can see it. And it captivates you still, even as small as it is. Now, another side of it that I've thought of more when when I'm holding it, is how much power there is in that candle flame. Because that candle flame could, if it ignited, that candle flame alone could ignite a fire. And it could take that huge building, it could burn it to nothing, it could burn it to ashes. It could kill every person in the room. It could all start from just that much fire. And then that fire just lights another fire, and everything is consumed by that power. Now, thinking of it in that way, it's a destructive force, but if we think of it as Shiva, and Shiva is the power that destroys delusion, that aspect of the divine which destroys delusion, that aspect of Om which destroys that which is not divine. It doesn't destroy the divine, it purifies. That power to transform, let's call it that instead of the power to destroy, because that's what Shiva really is, he's the power to transform. Gaze upon this light as a symbol of God's love. Wow. It seems so small in comparison to everything else, but so much concentrated power, and that power to create more of itself. You know, they say that fire, candle flame, no matter how much it's shared, it's never diminished. You can light thousands of candles off of one candle, and that candle will still continue to burn, and the fire won't be diminished. So many beautiful ways. I'm talking about the candle and the purification ceremony is the symbol of God's love, but then fire itself. Fire is burning in front of us. And you see, it's very helpful to manifest in tangible, observable ways these subtle states of awareness and understanding that we're seeking to grasp. Because we can talk about the transforming power of God's love and the infinite power of forgiveness and our ability to become completely renewed when we surrender and accept the divine. I mean, we can talk and talk and talk, but when you translate that into fire, and when you know how fire works, and you also know that it can be constructive or destructive. It can burn away impediments. You see that power properly directed. And in terms of God's love, it's how we take it. You know, there's a beautiful poem that Master really loved, The Hound of Heaven, it's called. Really beautiful, and there's a recording of him reciting it. And the story of the Hound of Heaven is this man, this devotee, who kept trying to find in every way other than his relationship with God the fulfillment his heart was deeply longing for. And he was pursued in his effort to find fulfillment in all those ways. He was pursued by this hound, is what he called it. Everywhere he would hear its footsteps, he would feel its shadow. It was always coming after him. And then finally in this beautiful poem, when he has nowhere else to turn, and the pursuer is finally reaching him, and what feels to him like a dark force starts coming, and he realizes that what he perceived as darkness was simply the hand of God reaching down to bless him. And it was the shadow of that hand coming toward him. And the Hound of Heaven turns out to be Divine Mother's love. So there's the fire image. It burns up our self-limiting identities in order to liberate our true self for the bliss that is our true nature. And there's the image of fire. And so we willingly, in the fire ceremony, we willingly, in the symbol of the ghee, we willingly offer our hearts into that fire. We instead of running away, we walk toward it. We walk into it. The purifying fire of grace. We call it that all the time. Sometimes that heat is not as pleasant as we would like. But when we realize what it's going to do for us and where it's going to take us. Swamiji has recently written a book called Love, Perfected, Life Divine. It'll be out in a few months, and these tapes last a lot longer, so this is April 2013, so it'll be out in a few months from this recording. But it's a beautiful story of perfect love, love perfected. And one of the important scenes in that story is the heroine's courage to step into fire, literally, as she's experiencing it. The story is somewhat magical. But the way the heroine experiences it, she has to have the courage to step into fire and trust God that even though she appears to be stepping into fire, nothing that is of lasting value to her will be hurt. And everything that will be left will be the only thing she wants. Purification, that's the word I'm trying to say, obviously. So every Sunday morning, Swamiji would sit there and he would recite the Gayatri Mantras. Now we use a recording of Swami reciting the Gayatri Mantra, but then he just recited it, and we recited it with him, and he would sit there. And also, every week he would speak about fire and the symbol of fire. I believe somewhere in the archive of Ananda recordings, I'm pretty sure a lot of those were recorded. Probably the quality's not so great, but the content is impressive. Because every week he would give a 10 or 15-minute talk about the symbol of fire. And every week he would say something he hadn't said before. And then together we would concentrate with him and say the mantra ourselves as well as we were able to. Swami pronounces it perfectly. Now with the recording we have a better chance. But one should not refrain from doing it for fear of not doing it perfectly. As well as we can do it is good enough. God reads the heart. And even though there is a certain power in correct pronunciation, so we shouldn't be lazy about it, nor should we be paranoid about it. Just do our best and that'll be that. In that respect, and this, we're not talking mantras, but Swami Kriyananda spoke of Rajasi Janakananda, who was a businessman from Kansas City, Missouri. That's the center of the United States, and it's the heartland. It has lots of, it's just the middle of America. And he used to pronounce Sri Yukteswar's name as Sir Ruktetraji. I mean, how he managed to not hear how it was really pronounced, but that's probably what it sounded like to him. Recently there was some discussion about trying to correct people's pronunciation of even Paramhansa Yogananda. People have accents, they hear words the way they hear them. A very good friend of mine used to always call me Asher. People told me, why don't you tell him what your name really is? I said, that is my name. He knows my name. He hears it, and when it comes out of his mouth, he says Asher, and there it is. I can't tell him. If I said it's pronounced Asha, he would say, yeah, Asher. It's the way our ears are made. In other words, God understands. But if you're capable of learning it correctly, by all means, Swamiji has it on the recording. And then, of course, after that part of the fire ceremony with the ghee, then the second part, when we do the Mahamrita Jaya, I have to forget the word Mahamudra, which is, of course, part of Kriya. I kept hearing myself say that, and I kept thinking, I'm just talking, and the word would go by, and a little piece of my mind would be randomly thinking, there is something wrong with what you just said. Here you are talking about Sanskrit and the perfect pronunciation, and you're not even calling the mantra by the right name. But I couldn't, until a few minutes ago, grasp it because I was on to something else. Mahamrityunjaya, which is probably still not quite pronounced correctly. I always avoid pronouncing it. I call it the second one, the one that isn't the Gayatri Mantra. In any case, and that's the one where it's to Shiva. And Shiva, I was saying that Master didn't really emphasize the gods, because the gods are a way, again, of concretizing, of making clear in a way that's more easily graspable something that really doesn't have that form. Although Master essentially said that the gods are real in this very intriguing statement, that different souls take turns playing the part of the gods. Like, as Swamiji put it, there's always a king of England, but it's not always the same jiva that has the role of the king of England. I really can't go any farther than that. I'm just going to leave that dangling out there. I've just told you 100% of what I know. But the concept of Shiva as that aspect of the divine, and literally it's that aspect of Om. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are the three aspects of Om. The creative aspect of Om, the preserving aspect of Om, and that Om which just takes everything away again, because you see nothing lasts. The Om, it's a manifestation of the infinite, but it's by its very nature, it's not, the manifestation is temporary. The source is eternal. And Shiva, which I've always really liked Shiva. I just like the idea of that powerful transforming force, and how God manifests in us as that powerful transforming force. It's kind of a joke in our community. I'm very good at throwing things away. I'm not a person who hoards things, and Sometimes when people are moving or really trying to clean out their apartments, and their own attachment or emotional confusion, emotional complications with the things that they own make it hard for them to do that, I offer to come over and be Shiva with them. And I can sit next to someone and help them destroy their attachments, and sometimes meaning to shed their stuff by really understanding whether or not the continuation of this reality is to your benefit or not. So this mantra being to Shiva without necessitating the image of the meditating yogi with the Ganges pouring from his head and the Kundalini and the snake and all that, which are fabulous images. But we're not Hindus, and we don't worship the gods and goddesses, but we are yogis. And we definitely want to draw God to us in that transforming reality. And that is an aspect of God. So we do that mantra, and what we hold in our hand for that mantra is rice. And rice is fascinating when you think of it. I mean, we're not rice farmers, so we don't know this, but every little grain of rice in there, they're really, really small. Hold a handful of grain in your hand. It's really small. But if you plant those, they're seeds. If you plant them, then a huge plant will grow, and it'll make hundreds, thousands of other little rices. And each one of those grains of rice can also be planted, and wow, isn't that a great symbol for desires and karma right there? They look so tiny, but if you feed and water them in the right way, they'll just proliferate and make more and more and more and more, which is not exactly what we want. Not by the time we're really seeking self-realization. By the time we're seeking self-realization, we want to dissolve all those vrittis. We want to take all those seeds of karma, all the things that we may have done wrong in the past that have set in motion corrective energy and unlearned lessons. Once we realize that our goal is God, and what we really want is the divine, and we'll live through whatever else we have to live through, but the fundamental lesson has been learned. I put it like this sometimes: when you do anything, because we're ego identified with our actions and so on, you're really sending out a boomerang. The modern vernacular is what goes around comes around, which is fun. And so you throw the boomerang out, and you have that picture in your mind that the boomerang goes way far away, but the nature of the device and the way it's thrown cause it to make a big circle, and then it comes right back to where you started. Where it started, which is your ego identification with that action. Because of what Master called the thwarting crosscurrents of ego, sometimes that boomerang will go out really far, because even though we may have done things that they're going to require corrective energy, we've got so much energy moving that we can kind of outrun them for a while. Or you might say we flung the boomerang so far that many incarnations might even pass before it comes all the way back to us. But it will. But conceivably, you see, by the time it comes all the way back to us, we have understood the fundamental lesson that my only satisfaction comes from God. And whatever I have done in the past, I repudiate. But nonetheless, the energy may still be there to hit you. And that's often where the guru will take your karma. He'll intercede. And the energy has to come back, but he'll take the blow, so to speak. Or the atmosphere of divine understanding that we ourselves have created. By the time that boomerang comes back, it's like a meteorite going through the atmosphere, and almost all of it is burned up. And that's the concept of mitigated karma. Oh, I broke my finger, but I was supposed to, you think, oh, perhaps I was, karmically destined to lose my hand, said I just broke my finger. So everything's good, because everything's less than it would have been if I wasn't a devotee and didn't have a master, and didn't have a God-realized master to protect me. So when we're saying the mantra that isn't the Gayatri Mantra, the other mantra, which is to Shiva and to the dissolution of all of everything that limits us, and to save the whole world in that way, you take a little seed of rice, and it's the potentiality of an enormous amount of karma. And this is a direct symbol of what we talk about and teach in Kriya, where we have vrittis, which are whirlpools of energy, which have a center point of some egoic commitment. And the river of divine awareness, we're trying to draw it up the spine with power to the spiritual eye. But all these vrittis, just like whirlpools in a river, draw that energy so that it instead of going to the divine, it hovers around this egoic commitment. But if the river becomes very powerful, think now of a physical river, the whirlpools get drawn into that current because the current going toward the sea is more powerful than the draw of whatever is in the center of the whirlpool. It's a perfect image for our karma. We have these karma, vrittis of karma, of an egoic commitment to some idea, but the way we really transcend them is we perceive a higher reality and they simply cease to interest us. And so symbolically, and the energy that we use to draw the energy up the spine is the transforming power of God. So here's the fire, which represents the transforming power of God, and we pick up rice, a handful of rice even, and each of those grains represents, seeds of karma that we're going to burn up right now. We're not going to have to plant them, let them sprout, let them do all the other things they have to do. This is what Kriya does. When I talk about the purification ceremony tomorrow, in the next segment of this, it's what Kriya does. Kriya is the transforming power of the love of God. It's the fire of divine energy. It's the river, all the images that we want to use. And Kriya draws those vrittis, those whirlpools of feeling, right in and dissolves the karma, and then it never has to be planted and grow. Otherwise, people learn by having it grow, and then they're looking at it. And that's why Swami Master says in autobiography, one round of Kriya, which is drawing the energy through all the chakras, up to the spiritual eye and then back to the base of the spine, is the equivalent of 1 year of right living. Because you can work out as much karma in one Kriya breath, which is an inhalation and an exhalation, as you can in a whole year of having all your karma manifest in a physical way and have to deal with it. So you just pick up that handful of rice, you chant the mantra, which in and of itself dissolves the vrittis of karma within you, and then you throw the rice into the fire, usually a few grains at a time, in keeping with the sound of the mantra, and it's real. It's not superstition. It's not just ritual. It's as powerful as your commitment to it. It's as powerful as your concentration on it. But the potential for actual change of consciousness. Master says in autobiography that ritual is not the opposite of delusion. But ritual engaged in with real awareness and deep commitment can have a profound effect in changing our consciousness. And change of consciousness is the opposite of delusion, uplifted consciousness. So I think that that's pretty much all that I have time to say. I hope that this helps you. I've had the honor of participating in these rituals for many, many years, and I'm a little more, I'll use the word liturgically oriented than some. I like worship ceremonies very much, but I like them because I deeply feel they engage the heart as well as the mind, and they engage the imagination. They're artistic in many beautiful ways, and putting all of those forces together can really be transformative. And insofar as you have access to these or to the recordings of Swamiji doing the mantras and can make your own little fire ceremonies, I deeply encourage you to do so for the spiritual benefit that's possible. God bless you.